All right. Well, I know we have a lot to discuss. I know you probably have a ton of burning questions. So we'll go ahead and get started. As I said, my name is Dr. Rebecca Mears. I'm a member of the VIN Foundation Student Debt Education team, joined by our featured presenter, Dr. Tony Bartels, as well as Jordan Ben-Shia and Taylor Oliver, that'll also be in the background helping out with things. So thanks everyone for joining. I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad that you're curious about this stuff because that's definitely the first step is wanting to know more. I do want to give a couple of quick shout outs to those that helped us to spread the message about this webinar and the content that the VIN Foundation provides. So your pre-vet advisors and clubs, also the National Pre-Vet Club and APVMA as well. You all have been great partners in trying to spread awareness of this event. So thank you so much for that. We greatly appreciate your work and your efforts. Couple of housekeeping things before we get started. So we've been testing the chat. We know that that works. We try to keep the chat limited to any like technical issues, or if Dr. Bartels asks a question and wants some responses during the presentation, then you can type those into the chat. Otherwise, for questions that you want to submit, use the Q&A feature. You can ask questions anonymously there, which is nice. You can't do that in the chat. And you can also upvote questions, and that helps us to identify what are the most popular, most common concerning questions, and we can focus on trying to answer those live. Depending on how wild the Q&A gets, we'll get through as many of those questions as we possibly can. We may not get to all of them live, but we definitely always try to. Um, so we'll be working on that, and then the follow-up email will go to everyone that registered to attend, whether you can stay the whole time or not, it's okay. That will also contain the recording of this webinar. It will contain some follow-up information. Depending on how far through that Q&A we get, we'll potentially do some follow-up Q&A answers as well. So that's what we'll be getting into. Last thing I want to share is that, we're doing this awesome presentation tonight and trying to answer so many of those questions, but I will also encourage you to check out the Apply Smarter message boards. That is an area where you can talk to myself, Dr. Tony Bartels, the 100,000 veterinarians and vet students of the VIN community to ask your questions and get some, more personal answers or kind of learn some more about veterinary medicine. That is available to you for free. We just ask that you create a login, username, password, and then you can get on those Apply Smarter message boards and ask your questions. I will make sure that we drop the link to register for that in the chat. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bartels and get started here.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Dr. Mears. And a couple of things. Please remind me to demo how to get to the Apply Smarter message boards because as many questions as I'm sure you all have, some of them are going to probably be more specific than we may be able to handle in this group session. And that's a great opportunity to ask those questions on the message boards where we get to have some back and forth there and really think about your situation and provide a more detailed answer. There is a question from Tyler about the questions. Is there a way to find the Q&A section easily? The Zoom toolbar, maybe if you hit the three dots under the More section, you might find it if it's not obvious in your Zoom toolbar. Do you have any other suggestions for that?
Yeah, and I think it'll depend on if you're on mobile or
Okay.
desktop, but it should be down like towards usually it's the bottom of your screen. So if you just if you're on your phone, just tap on your screen and you should see those additional options pop up. And then it just has, like I can see here, it says just like Q&A and you can open that up in another window.
And we're positive just because I'm kind of rolling with what Tyler's saying here. We're positive we got the Q&A section enabled for everybody.
I will double check that in the background here, but I can see it on mine.
Yeah, me too. I see it. Okay, Brittany, thank
Okay,
you.
Brittany, thank you.
Cool. I wonder
Thanks, Becca.
if we type an example or somebody types an example one in there, if it'll pop up for Tyler. I don't. Oh, on a mobile. Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't done too many of the webinars on a
Let
mobile
me
there.
I'll figure out the answer to that because I'm, of course, on my desktop as well. I'll figure that out. Um,
Cool.
or
Now we got look at all
Becca
the
is also
examples.
on her phone, so she
Yeah,
can see it on her
great.
mobile and give Tyler some instructions. See, this is a team effort.
Look at that. Yeah. All right. Great. Okay, well, let's dive in. So, generally it takes me about an hour to get through the Apply Smarter content. We had to do a lot of updates, as I'm sure you're anticipating, because there's a lot of changes coming. And those of you that are applying for this particular VIMCAS cycle, right? So if you're submitting your application by September 15th through VIMCAS this year for starting vet school in 2026, there's a really, really good chance that you're going to be the guinea pigs that experience this change in how we finance or pay for a veterinary education if you're not lucky enough to pay for it out of pocket. So there's a lot to talk about, right? Because we've been operating under a system that has largely been unchanged for nearly 30 years, and now we're going to try something completely different. So there's going to be a lot to learn. Not only now as we try to interpret what it's supposed to do, but next year when we actually get to the act of applying for student loans and trying to figure out what supplemental private loans might look like and how best to use personal funds. All of that is going to be a new learning experience for those that are attending graduate and professional schools. So veterinary schools, something like veterinary school. So that's what we're going to attempt to talk about tonight. And generally the Apply Smarter concept here focuses mostly on how to maximize your opportunity of getting into vet school, and not only getting in, but getting into a school that will have you paying the least. So hopefully you won't need as much student loans to get through, and ideally trying to avoid as much uh, private loans as possible, because those can be a lot more complicating in terms of trying to not only pay for veterinary school, but navigate repayment afterwards. So this is going to be the Apply Smarter What's Changed edition, right? So we've got a lot to get through here. So some basics we have to cover first. How much does vet school cost, right? We're gonna show you how to find that information. We can't talk about cost or debt without talking about income. So we'll share with you how much a veterinarian earns, although that information will likely change. Hopefully it'll continue to increase by the time you get to and through veterinary school. But it helps to give you a baseline of what veterinarians are earning out there in different types of practice. Knowing the difference between what I call discounted and non-discounted seats. You may know them as in-state versus out-of-state, but unfortunately, it's not as simple as in-state versus out-of-state. So there's a lot of different cost profiles for veterinary school seats, even within a single university. So I'll show you one. We have an example later. Washington State University is one of the more complicated ones out there. There's so many different cost profiles, even within the same school, that it does a really good job of illustrating how complicated that can be. But we want to help you identify those and obviously find the ones that are more discounted versus less discounted, because it will play into how much you ultimately have to borrow. We need to understand these impacts of the student loan changes that came from the One Big Beautiful Bill, right? The recent tax and spending legislation that passed or was signed into law on the 4th of July of this summer. And most of those changes will take effect after July 1st of 2026, at least the borrowing changes. And then we also want to show you how you can use the application statistics for schools to increase your odds of getting in and paying less for your education. So there's some information we want to share there that aligns with what we call the Apply Smarter concept at VIN Foundation. All right, so I've got a few questions for you here as well, and I'm going to use a separate platform called Menti, and I'm going to bring that over onto the screen in just a second. But it does a better job of allowing me to poll you, especially in larger groups than the Zoom one. So help me understand your application status. And the way Menti works is you can either open a new browser tab, or if you're on your phone, you can just take your phone and open up the camera app and you know focus it on that QR code, and it'll take you right to the Menti, and it'll allow you to participate in the Menti questions as I'm going through them here. And they're mostly at the front end of this presentation, but it does provide a way for us to do a little bit of interacting there. And the first question is, let's see, there's about 78 of you in there already, so that's great. So what is your vet school application status? From those of you that registered, it looked like the majority of you were going to apply for this next cycle, right? So you'd be submitting your application through VIMCAS by this September and then the following year. So it looks like the attendees are kind of panning out the same way. Although there looks like there's several more of you that are a few more cycles away. Cool. Thanks to you that are also here and just interested in the topic. That's great. Excellent. So those of you that are submitting your application for the next entry class or the next cycle, right? So the class that will enter in 2027, the new borrowing rules are going to be applicable to you, right? So those of you that are applying for this next cycle, again, you're going to be the guinea pigs. You're going to be kind of the test case for what does it look like when we change how we pay for a professional education like veterinary school. So next question is, when you apply to vet school, where will you call home? And this will kind of help me in talking about the schools that are likely to allow you to get through without having to use private loans and stay under the new borrowing limits, or at least minimize your exposure to loans that you may need to take above the new limits. Wow, pretty cool. Pretty cool smattering. It's also kind of cool to see where everybody's coming from here. Right. See a lot of states here that have veterinary schools, which is great, or soon will. Excellent. All right. Cool. And then what schools are you planning to apply to? All of them. Wow, that's ambitious. That's a lot of work. It's also expensive. At least five. All right. So hopefully maybe we can recalibrate the all, particularly if you are going to need to use student loans to get through school. All can be really dangerous, right? The apply smarter concept is really about focusing your application strategy so you don't put yourself in an awkward position, particularly now. And this is one of the things that I'm probably most concerned with, is that there's a very real possibility that you could get accepted to a veterinary school and then not be able to attend said veterinary school because you can't pay for it, right? That's not something we've seen in, nearly 30 years, but it's a very real possibility under these new borrowing rules, right? So the higher your cost, the more you'll have to rely on loans outside of the federal system, which means the risk of not being able to obtain that financing increases as well, right? So we're going to have to be very careful about where we apply to veterinary school going forward. Um, if you're relying on student loans, and somewhere between 80 and 90% of veterinary students graduate with some amount of student debt. So you're going to have to be pretty careful about that. So let me return back to here and see how many questions I had for you. All right, great. So let's dive in a little bit. I'll tell you about myself a little, and then we'll talk about the what's changed in here as well. So why do I care so much about this? Well, I'm a veterinarian. I'm married to a veterinarian. I also have a boatload of student debt combined with my wife. So we have more than $400,000 of veterinary school debt that we currently manage using the federal income driven repayment system, which has changed a lot over the years. So I graduated in 2012, and I've been through 3 or 4 different versions of income driven repayment at this point, and now my loans are kind of sitting in a state of suspended animation, accruing interest while we decide where we're going to go next, because repayment is also changing alongside of now the new borrowing rules. It's going to be very difficult for any of you to borrow this amount of student debt in federal student loans, right? So that's the part that's significantly changing, is that the loans that you're going to take on the federal side are going to be capped at a certain amount. And then if you need more than you can get in the federal student loans, you'll have to obtain that financing either through a private lender or come up with those funds some other way, right? So that's going to be the challenge. So we want to help you understand, well, what will your student loan balance be? Right? What schools are you considering? How much do you have to borrow? What does that look like under the new structure? And we do have some tools that we're working on updating to reflect these changes on the Student Debt Center. So vinfoundation.org / student debt center. The tool that we'll focus on and use as a case demonstration tonight is called the in-school loan estimator. And that'll help to show you what borrowing will look like under this new scenario. All right, so just to let you know, and we'll kind of let the cat out of the bag early here. What has changed, right? And then you can kind of think about that and chew on it a little bit as we present the rest of the material and ask any questions you have as they pertain to maybe your circumstances. But the recent tax and spending legislation that was signed on July 4th institutes some new borrowing constraints on the federal level. So now you have a $50,000 annual limit for professional school. So veterinary school is professional school. There's a $200,000 program limit. So you start at a veterinary school, that's your program. You're only allowed to borrow up to $200,000 for that veterinary degree. That can cause some issues, if you're transferring or, something like that, where we could see some, complex outcomes when if you move around between schools, maybe using up some of that limit and then ending up at a different school and not being able to get any federal student loans for the remainder of a new program. There's also a 257,500 lifetime limit, so that would include undergrad or maybe some graduate school loans or some other type of combination. Let's say you don't, maybe you're not applying this year, but you're starting a master's program or something next year, in anticipation of applying to vet school the following year or the year after. That's all going to count towards that lifetime limit. So whereas there were no limits previously on how much you could borrow at the federal level, we can argue whether that was right or wrong. It certainly made paying for any of those pathways a lot easier. Now we're going to institute these limits, which means once you run up against them, you're going to need to obtain funding elsewhere, right? So in most schools, the cost of attendance are going to exceed that either $50,000 per year or $200,000 in total to get through that program, which means you're probably going to need private loans or some other type of financing to pay for the remaining amount. Right now, there are still some schools that you can get through without having to, hit those limits, but they're few and far between. Right, so that's what we're going to kind of focus on, is how do you know which of those schools are, or which ones are those schools, and how you might be able to increase your odds of getting into those particular schools.
I
Some
know
borrowing and repayment
this is
secrets. It's always easier to manage less student debt than it is to manage more. And it's also easier to manage only federal student loans than it is to manage a combination of federal and private student loans. So if you are able to get through with federal and private student loans, repayment gets much more complicated, which also can limit some of your potential career plans after veterinary school, depending on how much private debt you have and what the terms of those repayment, um, the repayment of those private loans might look like. All right, so big picture, here we start kind of looking at, well, what does the tuition and fees tell us, right? And AAVMC does a good job of kind of compiling the tuition and fees of all the different schools. And here's the median, right? So we've got resident, and we can see that it's, it's increased over the years here. So, resident tuition is just, and we're just talking about tuition here. So maybe tuition and fees, not living expenses. So just if you want to just pay tuition, you can probably, as a resident of a state school, you can probably get by borrowing just federal student loans. But as soon as you accept an offer to a school where you're paying a non-resident rate or a private school rate, you're pretty much automatically above that annual $50,000 limit in just the tuition and fees, right? So you'll have to figure out some way of covering that difference just for the tuition, in addition to any living expenses that you may also need to cover um, while you're attending veterinary school. As we look on the way out, here's what that translates to into student debt. And this is, from the 2024 graduates, again, reported by AAVMC. We can see that there's some pretty big numbers here, right? I mean, and they're school specific. This doesn't list all of the schools. I can't really take a nice screenshot of this, but if you go to the AAVMC website where this data lives, you can scroll through that list of schools that shows you which are the, which schools do students graduate from that have a lower amount of student debt versus a higher amount of student debt. But we can see that, there's some ones that are obviously above that $200,000 mark routinely, and this is a median, right? So half of these are above that and half are below that, right? So obviously we're encouraging you to stay on the half that's below that rather than the half that's above that, right? We don't, that $200,000 number is going to be a pretty magical threshold for a lot of folks as they're looking at schools and what their total cost of attendance is. This is an older data set, but it was one of the last years that they layered on graduating students reporting their debt alongside their income. And I always found this to be really helpful in explaining this concept. But generally speaking, I find that, pre-veterinary students, veterinary students don't really understand the impact of how the cost of attendance translates to debt. And we also kind of lose the forest to the trees there because the income is roughly the same no matter what school that you graduate from, but the debt can be very, very different, right? So just when I look at something like that, that screams to me, if I stand to earn roughly the same as any student that graduates from any other veterinary institution, why do I want to pay 1.5, 2.5 times more than somebody else? Right. So, and this is going to become more important than ever, given the new borrowing limits, right? And the risk that the private loans can add to not only getting through veterinary school, but repayment afterwards as well. So what that really means is there's no Harvard effect, and we'll talk about that a little bit in just a couple minutes here. In terms of how much a veterinarian earns, well, it really depends on what type of practice you're going into and where you're going to do that practice. So these are the results from the annual AVMA senior survey. So they ask graduating veterinarians on their way out the door, what are you doing? How much you expecting to earn? And this is how the numbers shake out. So for the 2024 graduating class, which is the most recent data we have, we can see that companion animal exclusive and predominant are the highest. They're up there in the 137,000 range. And then we've got equine at the lowest around the $95,000 mark, right? So not only can your debt vary pretty widely depending on the school that you go to, but the practice that you pursue after veterinary school will also kind of determine where your income starts. Obviously, the higher your income, the easier it is to manage your debt, right? If you graduate from a school like Texas A&M and have $100,000 of student debt, and you go into companion animal medicine earning $140,000 a year, it's going to be relatively easy for you to manage your student debt. Right. If you go to a school like Midwestern and you have $300,000 of student debt and $100,000 of that is private student loans, and you're going to go work as an equine practitioner or maybe as a mixed animal practitioner and earn $100,000 a year, it's going to be significantly more challenging to manage that. Right. So how much you pay for your education and what your mix of student debt looks like, plus what you choose to do as a veterinarian, will all contribute to how easy or how hard it is for you to pay back your student loans. So what's this Harvard effect? I call it that because generally speaking, if you go to a school like Harvard, particularly maybe as Harvard Law, you expect to earn more just by virtue of graduating from that institution, right? We don't see that same thing in veterinary medicine, right? Again, the debt can vary pretty wildly. The income doesn't, right? It's a more narrow difference between the lowest and the highest income you earn as a veterinarian versus the lowest and the highest debt that you possibly could take on just based on which school you choose to go to. So debt to income ratio is one of those key performance indicators that the profession looks at a lot. So what's your student debt? What's your income? I take my student debt, divide it by my income, I get a debt to income ratio. Anytime we see a debt to income ratio greater than 1, it can complicate repayment, right? And the only way for you to really avoid having a debt to income ratio that's significantly greater than 1 is to be very careful about the schools that you apply to and the seats that you target. When it comes to the seat types, right, here's, again, coming back to that in-state versus out-of-state, these are just some other terms that either I use or I see being used out there, right? So for in-state seats, we've got resident or discounted. Out-of-state seats typically are non-resident, or they're full price private school seats, right? So there's a bunch of different terms that are used to describe those, but generally speaking, you're looking for those ones that are going to be the least costly for you. So apply smarter, apply to the schools with the lowest cost to you as possible. Lower student debt means a higher return on your personal investment. Right? So it'll be easier for you to pay back that student loans and increase that return on the investment that you're taking on by going to veterinary school. When you apply to veterinary school, most of you are going to go through the VIMCAS system, so the Veterinary Medical College Application Service that's run by AAVMC. There's a few schools that operate outside the VIMCAS, and some of the ones that are coming online, depending on when they start taking applicants, sometimes that first class that they accept will operate outside of the VIMCAS system. But the overwhelming majority of schools that you're going to apply to are covered under the VIMCAS system. So thinking beyond all of those transcripts, prereqs, letters of recommendations, whether or not the school requires an interview, make it easier on yourself. Target those schools that are going to help you increase your odds of getting in and cost you the least, right? Because that will be the easiest way to stay out of some of these really complicated financing and repayment scenarios that we're going to see starting next year and beyond, as those students who start veterinary school next year then graduate in 2030 and have to pay back that student debt. So your first test, where do you want to go and why, right? I already saw your list of schools that you plan to apply to. So when you say you want to apply to all, right, why, right? That tells me that you're kind of taking that spray and pray approach, right? If I apply to every school, I'll increase my chances of getting in. That's maybe true, right? But you're also going to increase the chances that you're going to get into a school that's going to cost you more than you're going to be able to borrow in federal student loans, which then again starts to complicate things. Now, if you don't have to use federal student loans, or you've got a 529 or some significant assets that you or your family holds that can help make up that difference, then it really doesn't matter that much, right? But I think those are few and far between, right? So, again, most veterinarians are using veterinary school loans or school student loans to get to and through veterinary school.
I see an upvoted question related to that. Um, Looking at if will the vet school that you choose be important if you want to specialize in a specific small animal field? That's got a couple of upvotes, so I think while we're touching on that, might be a good time
Yeah,
to address that.
that's a great question. I would love to see a study on that. They have done studies on that in human med, but not in vet med, to my knowledge. I would love to see that done, but to my knowledge, I do not know of, especially a small animal specialty, right? Those are the more common ones. And, you know, quite frankly, most veterinarians that go to veterinary school end up practicing some type of small animal medicine. So any of those schools are going to adequately prepare you for post-graduation specialization. And it's kind of depends more, or at least it seems to depend more on the relationships and experiences that you garner during school that will then lead you to be able to do those internship and specialty pathways after school. But I have not seen any data that says that if you go to UC Davis or Tufts or CSU, you will have an easier time getting a residency XYZ, right? I mean, but it would be really cool to do that study. So hopefully somebody will do that soon. All right, so this kind of, again, these are not things that generally pre-vets want to think about, but they're going to be very important coming soon here. Are you going to need student loans, right? And how much, right? And are the schools that you're considering going to have cost profiles that are beyond that $50,000 annual limit? Where do you live, right? What vet schools do you have available to you to receive a discounted tuition rate? So not necessarily an in-state rate, right, for the full 4 years, but is there at least a school that you can get a discounted rate for? And the answer to that question is always yes, right? There are 5 veterinary schools that allow you to change your residency status after the first year. Right, so maybe you'll have a little challenge financing that first year because you have to pay as a non-resident for that first year. So you'll probably need some federal student loans and probably some private student loans to get through that first year. But then years 2, 3, and 4 are likely to be that in-state rate where maybe you can get through with only using those federal student loans for the duration of that program. Right. So those are competitive seats, right? They're not easy to get into, right? Because when you start applying for out of state seats and you don't live in that state, the odds of you getting accepted are a little bit lower than if you lived in that particular state. But everybody can apply to those schools that has that option for being able to reduce your tuition after that first year. What are your estimated living expenses? Are you going to be able to cover some of those out of pocket, or do you anticipate having a job? It can be very difficult to work during veterinary school. It's not impossible. It really just depends on your schedule, how you're able to manage your time, and whether or not that additional job is worth it for you to cover those types of expenses. So if you have to borrow your living expenses as well, well, then now we're going to run into those same challenges we've been talking about hitting those upper limits on the federal student loans and needing those private loans. If you have access to other funding sources, so I mentioned 529 plans, right? So if your family started a 529 plan for you and you haven't used it for your undergrad and you have some funds left over, maybe that's an option for you to help pay for some of these additional expenses. Scholarships, grants, other types of loans like health profession student loans, loans for disadvantaged students. We'll talk about some of those in a little more detail here shortly as too. One of the scholarships that we're super excited to talk to you about here from VIN Foundation perspective is the Mike Dunn Scholarship created by Becky Gottschalk. So we're on our second cohort of those. So we have 4 scholarship recipients currently. So a set that are starting their first year this year, a set that are starting their second year. This scholarship kind of aligns with the Apply Smarter concept. So it pays for tuition and fees up to $35,000 each year for a maximum of $140,000, as long as the projected total cost of your program is $170,000 or less. Right. So this actually helps you to. We have a tool on here, and I'll just kind of introduce this really quickly. But one of the we'll call it a side effect, right? We had to create a tool to help identify, well, which schools would fall under that $170,000 threshold to be eligible for the scholarship, right? So it allows you to select your state, where do you live, right? And which schools would be eligible. So I live in Colorado. Which schools would fall under that $170,000 threshold, right? Which also would fall under the $50,000 limits that the federal student loans currently have, right? So if you were adamantly trying to avoid using private loans, then that also would be very similar to the criteria we use for the VIN Foundation Mike Dunn Scholarship, right? So these would kind of show you at least the schools that for the scholarship applicants that are applying for the class starting in 2026, which might very well be many of you, right? These would be the schools that if you applied to and were accepted and living in Colorado, that would be you would be eligible for that scholarship if you were selected. So I see some of you have jumped on and are playing with that now. So that's one way that you can start to narrow that search and see, well, based on where I live, what set of schools do I have available to me that will help me avoid some of those, complex financing scenarios to get through veterinary school. Speaking of, let's talk about those now. All right, so how are you going to pay for veterinary school under these new rules? So we've got several choices, right? So there's federal student loans, private student loans, family personal funding that I'm kind of lumping together as anything else that you can come up with to pay for those expenses on your own. And then we've got scholarships and grants. If there's some other ones there, feel free to toss them out as suggestions in the chat or ask about them in the Q&A panel. But for federal student loans, right, again, we've got this limit now that's going to apply to anybody who's starting a program July 1st, after July 1st of 2026. So you're limited to $50,000 or the school's cost of attendance, whichever is lower. The direct unsubsidized loans that have the $50,000 limit for something like veterinary school will have a fixed interest rate for the life of the loan. As an example, we don't know what the interest rates will be for next year when some of you might be starting veterinary school, so the academic year 2026, 2027. But for this academic year, so the students that started this fall, just a couple of weeks ago, for the 2025-2026 academic year, the direct unsubsidized rate is 7.94%. So just under 8%. Those loans accrue interest as soon as they are received, right? So for those students that started this semester, I just did a session yesterday with Washington State first-year students, and they received their loans on August 11th. So they've had 16 days worth of interest that they've accrued on their loans so far that they received for that semester. There's no payments due during school for those direct unsubsidized loans, and there's no credit check or credit score required, which is going to be really important compared to the private loans, right? So federal student loans are generally much easier to get, much more flexible, right? They're the actual most flexible debt you'll ever have, but they are really annoying. But you definitely want to max those out first before you seek out any additional funding. There are some limited other types of federal student loans available depending on the school that you attend. Uh, the biggest one is called the health profession student loan, and that is only eligible at certain schools for certain programs, namely ones that train health professionals like veterinarians. Right, so not every school offers these. Most of the state schools do, some of the private schools do, but it's one of those things to put on your list of questions for whatever school you're applying to. Do you offer health profession student loans? And what's the average amount of health profession student loan that your students receive? You can do the same thing for loans for disadvantaged students. They have a different eligibility criteria. Both of them are needs based, but it seems to be a more kind of relative needs based. So, how do you compare against the other folks that have applied for those loans in that year? So, it's always worth applying for them. You may have to provide your parents' financial information for those. That's in contrast to the direct unsubsidized loans. When you apply for federal student loans or when you submit FAFSA for professional school, you're considered to be independent from your parents no matter what your dependency status is on their tax return, right? Once you get to graduate school, professional school, they generally don't care what your family financial circumstances are. They don't play a role in determining your direct unsubsidized loan need, but that information will be used for determining your health profession student loans or loans for disadvantaged students need, right? So a little bit of a kind of confusing there, but your parents' financial information won't affect how you apply for these. In fact, nearly every veterinary student receives the maximum available direct unsubsidized loan award amount because their student aid index, the measure that they use to take stock of your assets and such and income, is usually always either zero or negative. That can change if you're married or maybe veterinary medicine is a second career for you and you have some previous assets or relatively significant income. So it's not always that case, but for the overwhelming majority of veterinary students, they're eligible for the maximum award under the direct unsubsidized loans. Federal student loans, what makes them the most flexible are these access to income driven repayment options, public service loan forgiveness that can help you eliminate your debt quickly if you're working for a qualifying organization. And they also have the most beneficial deferment, forbearance, and discharge provisions should you need them, right? So this is what makes them more flexible than, say, a private loan, right? Private loans are, and we're going to talk about those in just a second, don't generally care what your income is, right? So if you think about that, if you're planning on doing an internship, residency, specialization, or you're planning to work in an area of veterinary medicine that might pay less than, say, companion animal medicine, the higher your private student loan balance is, the more difficult it's going to be for you to pay for those loans, right? But in contrast, your direct loans allow you to make payments based on your income. So if your income is lower, the payments are lower. Right. So while you're doing an internship or while you're doing a residency that pays, 30, 40, 50, $60,000 a year, at least the federal student loan payment will be a percentage of that income. So it's easier to manage than, say, a private loan that, again, doesn't care if you're earning $50,000 a year or $150,000 a year, right? The payment is just based on the amount that you borrowed, which is why it's so important to really avoid those private loans to the extent possible. Right, actually, let me jump back at those out of order. Here we go. Great. Here's the private loan. All right, so private loans are going to be loans that are available through a bank, credit union, online lender. The eligibility is credit based. And this is where I anticipate we're going to run into some snags. So the whole reason the federal student loans were so flexible and maybe a little bit too easy before is that it didn't require any kind of credit check, credit score to be eligible, right? But to get loans, private loans, they're going to use a credit score, your credit history, maybe some income information to determine your eligibility for those loans, right? So how many of you know your credit score, right? And if you don't, you're going to need to know the answer to that question. And if you don't have a credit score or have very little or no credit history, it's time to start, right? It can take 6 months for you to actually start building any kind of credit history or score that a private lender will look at favorably, right? So if you don't have a credit card in your name that maybe you're paying the balance off routinely and it's got a credit history of at least 6 months, then you kind of need to get on that train, especially if you um, are expecting to need private loans, right? Preparing yourself to be eligible to be considered for those private loans um, is the first step. Right? You want to know your credit score, know your credit history. If you don't have one, start building one. If you've got a poor credit history, then you kind of have to work to repair it sooner rather than later. Right? They're going to be looking for. We just had Dr. Mears and I had a call yesterday with a private lender that was telling us that their eligibility requirements are a minimum credit score of somewhere between 640 or 660. So right around that 650 range. So check your score, see what it is. Um, And if you don't have one yet, or you don't have any kind of credit history, then you're going to want to start building that credit history. There's a very good chance that many of you are going to be required to bring a cosigner to the table in order to get past some of this initial check if you don't have a very robust credit score or credit history, right? So that's going to be any credit worthy adult who would be willing to sign on to the fact that if you're unable to pay for that debt for any reason, they will be responsible for paying for it. Right. And that's not something that exists on those federal student loans. Right. So they're only ever your responsibility. The private loans, particularly while you're getting through veterinary school, for many of you, is probably going to have somebody else on the hook for them. You're going to really want to read the fine print, right? Every private loan can be different, right? All of the federal loans are the same, right? That's one of the nice things about it. They're very consistent. Everybody's eligible for them. There is no credit check on them. Private loans are about as opposite as it gets, right? The interest rates can be different for everybody. I mean, you might have a different interest rate than your classmate sitting next to you. That interest rate can be fixed or also known as what's called variable. So it can change based on how the interest rates in the macro economy are changing. You can have different repayment options. Some of them require you to make payments during school. Others will allow you to defer those loans during school. How they handle the interest during school will be important as well. Do they take the interest that accrues if you're opting to defer those loans and add it to the principal periodically? Some of them might not, some of them may, right? These are things you're going to have to pick through in the terms and conditions of the loan that you're offered before you sign it. The terms, how long they will allow you to pay it. The longer you're in repayment, the lower the monthly payment, but the more you're going to pay in interest. Right? The shorter the time frame, the higher the monthly payment, the lower the amount of interest you pay on the loan. Right? But depending on how much you need, it may not be very realistic for anybody to choose a shorter time frame for those private loans. So again, this is in pretty stark contrast to the federal student loans, which for most of you are going to have a 25, if not 30-year repayment time frame available. Doesn't mean you need to use that entire time frame, but at least it allows you that flexibility in case you do need it. Private loans can also have some origination fees. Federal student loans do have origination fees as well, but they're low. They're 1% in the 1% range for the direct unsubsidized loans. Private loans, they may or may not have origination fees, but you want to make sure that they allow you to pay that loan off early if you'd like to. Some Some loans actually will have prepayment penalties, right? These are things that you'll want to pick through in those terms and conditions as well. And then if there are late payments, then you want to understand what those fees are for those. So here I tapped my inner Jordan Benshia, who's the executive director of the VIN Foundation, and created somewhat of a checklist of questions you should be asking your private lender here. So take this with you. If you have to sit down with a private lender ahead of time, maybe even before you, oh, I got a little typo in there. Maybe even before you choose to apply. I mean, you can start to establish a relationship with a credit union, a private lender well ahead of time, right? And start that conversation, start walking with them and say, hey, what do you, I mean, they're actively putting these packages together now, right? If you approach them and say, hey, I anticipate needing XYZ dollars to get through veterinary school. What do you got for me, right? What am I looking at, right? And you probably want to visit with more than one lender, right? So you can compare offers against each other and see who's offering a better deal or option, and who has more favorable answers to questions like this. So these are very similar to the bullets that I showed you here, but feel free to use this as a starting point or build on it. Uh, Report back to us in the message boards of what you're learning so we can continue to improve, because we're going to have to come up with a lot of content in terms of things to look for, things to avoid, good things, bad things when it comes to private loans, because they're going to be a necessary evil for many of our colleagues as they work through veterinary medicine.
I actually think that's a great opportunity, if you don't mind, to show how to get to those message boards,
Mhm.
for those that are wondering and have follow-up questions and things.
Certainly. So, let me think about where I have that. So I know that at the end here, I've got a resource list. And one of those resources, we have a link for what's called the pre-veterinary student application. So if you haven't already done this, so vinfoundation.org/prevet app, you can create an account. There's a button that'll be visible here. I think it doesn't show because I'm already logged into VIN. Oh, there it is. So you can create an account here, and it'll ask you username, password, what school, or what's kind of your top school, so we can assign a school to your profile, and then it'll generate a username and password that you can use to log in. So let me see if I click here. I think it already knows that I'm logged in. So it logged me in with my VIN username and password. Once you have those credentials, it'll drop you on what we call the VIN Foundation Center. And we've got a tile here that relates to the Apply Smarter concept, the content that we're talking about tonight. And here there's a link to the Apply Smarter message board area. So the Apply Smarter message board is we kind of steal from what the heart and soul of VIN, which is a veterinary information network online community of more than 100,000 veterinarians and veterinary students, but it's colleagues helping colleagues. So when veterinarians have questions about complex cases or things in and outside of veterinary medicine, they can post them on the message boards, and various people have experience with a lot of these different things, and we can come in here and answer those questions. So here are some of the discussions that live in the Apply Smarter folder. This is a resource that we put out that talks about the changes to federal student loans, not only borrowing, but repayment. And then if you had questions about those changes, you can comment on them. We can see there's 18 or so discussions from other veterinarians in there. If you had a question that you wanted to post specifically about your circumstances, you can hit this post new discussion. It'll open a posting window for you. And you can also choose to post anonymously. Dr. Mears and I all know who you are, right? But the rest of the community won't. Right? So you give your discussion a title. You can check the anonymous box if you prefer to do that. And then you just have to type your question in there. And the great thing about posting to the boards is that there's probably other people that are wondering the same thing you are. right? So if you ask the question and we can walk through and provide some guidance or insight on those questions that you have, not only do you get the answers that you need, but the rest of the community gets to learn from it as well, right? So hopefully we don't all have to learn the hard way, right? So we can learn from each other in that regard. All right. Any other questions while I fish through where I left off?
Let me pull our most upvoted question right now. And that is, what are the 5 vet schools that are the ones that offer the residency switch after
Oh,
your first year?
I'll show you that in just a second.
Okay, well then here's our other next upvoted
Okay.
question.
Yeah.
Is it risky applying to and enrolling in a new school that is just opening or is still provisionally accredited?
Oh man, coming out of the gates, gun blazing there. Um, in what way? I guess I guess there's always a little bit of a risk there, right? The fact that they're provisionally accredited should give you some assurance, right? We have seen one school, and unfortunately, University of Arizona has struggled a little bit for students to pass their NAVLE after they finish schooling there. Um, that's not necessarily going to be the case for any other new school, right? We're going
What
to
is
need this.
NAVLE?
Oh, so NAVLE is the North American Veterinary Licensing Exam, right? So that would be, I guess, one of the quantifiable risks is you could take away from a case study like recent graduates from a recently accredited program or a new school like University of Arizona, is that their graduates are having a harder time than other schools passing that exam, and you need to pass that exam in order to practice veterinary medicine. Although we've seen, Long Island and LMU and help me out with some other of the more recent schools haven't had that same kind of problem passing NAVLE. So, Arizona could be an anomaly, right? And it's not like, they're all, I mean, in order to maintain or achieve that full accreditation, their students have to, more than 80% of the students have to pass that licensing exam, and they're right below it, right? I mean, it's like 79% or something. So, they're really close. So still the overwhelming majority of students that are graduating are passing that. Uh, but there's still more than we see generally at other schools that are not. So that could potentially be a risk. Uh, from a financing standpoint, from a paying for it standpoint, it shouldn't necessarily be a risk, right? As long as they have the provisional accreditation, their program will be eligible for those direct unsubsidized loans. And then, like everybody else, you'll have to scramble to find some other funding for any amounts that you need above and beyond that. So I don't necessarily think you should avoid a new program, particularly if it's a program that will cost you less, right? So we've got some new programs coming online that will have some lower cost profiles. So Utah, there's a program, Clemson in South Carolina. There are some other ones that are in various states of potentially opening soon. Rowan in New Jersey, right? So that's a huge one. One of the most frequent questions we would get asked during these Apply Smarter sessions was, hey, I live in New Jersey, which is the most densely populated state in the nation. I don't have a vet school in my state. What do I do? Well, now you have a vet school in your state, right? And they have a discounted rate for those of you that live in New Jersey. I would not pass that up, right? I mean, those are things that fall squarely into that apply smarter concept that you're going to want to look into to at least help to keep that cost profile down so you can graduate, practice as a veterinarian, and increase the return on that investment.
I'm going to give you one more before I let you go because this was an early on question and is also very upvoted. If there will be a few year gap between my undergrad and applying for vet school, are there any concerns with my education still being relevant by then?
Oh, that's a tough one to answer. I guess it depends on what you're studying and what you're doing during that 3 years. But you may want to check with the schools that you're applying for to make sure that those credits that you have earned are still eligible to be considered for your prerequisites. 3 years should be, but that's not that's not walking around knowledge for me. That's something that you may want to inquire about directly with the schools that you're applying too, regarding whether or not those classes, that coursework will still be eligible, so you meet the application requirements for that particular university.
I echo that. So I took a odd path to vet school myself, and so I had to live through this. Some vet schools do have rules about how long ago you can have taken those prerequisite courses. So that is definitely something that is vet school specific, and you'll want to check in with their admissions group to ask what that rule is if it applies at that school.
Very cool. All right. Well, let me kind of finish this section, and then we'll get to, which are the schools that allow you to get those discounted seats. But how else are you going to pay for this if you don't want to use private loans? And that's where the family support personal funds can come in handy. If you're going to use personal funds or tap into your family to help pay for veterinary school, better to do that on the front end than to wait until you get deeper into school or even done, right? So the more you can use those funds that might have been allocated specifically for this purpose earlier on will help you reduce the amount of interest that accrues during school. You'll graduate with a lower balance. You'll have less to manage. It's always easier to manage less than it is to manage more, right? And those first and second year loans are going to be the most expensive loans that you take because they have the most time to accrue interest, right? So if you're going to use those, or your family has some, you know, money set aside to gift you after you graduate from veterinary school, it would be better applied on the front end versus the back end. 529 funds, if you have access to some or you have some left over after getting through undergrad, they can help to offset some of these costs, particularly in those early years, those first and second years. And maybe if you attend one of those schools that allow you to change your residency status after the first year, it can help you pay that higher price tag for that first year before you get to the discounted rate the second year and beyond. I would encourage you to refrain from cashing out any tax advantaged retirement funds, whether they're yours or they're a family member's, to avoid student loans, right? Particularly the federal student loans. You still want to max out those first. I mean, depending on the type of private student loan rates you're getting, I guess there could be an argument made that you might want to use some funds like that to stay out of some really precarious private student loans. And I guess I anticipate the lender that we met with yesterday is telling us that maybe private loans for a qualified borrowers might have interest rates a percentage point above the direct unsubsidized loan. So those are around 8%. Maybe you're looking at a 9% loan. But in my opinion, that's probably the most favorable rate you're going to get. It's quite likely that many of you, particularly those of you that have marginal credit scores or very low credit history, will probably be looking at interest rates that might be in the double digits for private loans, right? So those are going to be pretty expensive, right? So again, just more incentive to try to target a school that's at the lower cost profile and trying to stay out of that private loan bucket as much as you can.
Tony, you had also mentioned like parental help or family help. We did have a question about if parents want to help their college age students save for vet school, assuming that undergrad is paid for, is adding money to the student's 529 or starting a 529 a good way to do so?
I would say so. I mean, that's um, I am not a financial planner. Now I know Glenn is here. If he wants to chime in on that one, I'd love to hear what he has to say. But a 529 is a great option for covering educational expenses like you would see for veterinary school, right? So you get state tax benefits for contributing to them. It grows tax free. And if you take them out for these approved purposes like higher education expenses, like veterinary school expenses, then they can be withdrawn tax-free as well. So I think they're a great option. They're not the only option, but I think it's a great option to consider if you were trying to save for a future veterinary students funds in the future. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Oh, so scholarship. Scholarships are great, free money if you can get it, right? But they're not in very large amounts, right? Except for maybe if you're lucky enough to get like the VIN Foundation, um, VIN Foundation scholarship that covers your tuition and fees. The average scholarship award received by about half of veterinary students is about $6,000 per year, right? And that's great, right? But it's, not enough to maybe um, keep you out of private student loan debt. I think I've got some cleaning up to do of um, my Prezi. I'll have to do that. Sorry. I have an example here. I wanted to show that, and I'm having a hard time getting it to display. Let me see if I can. Let me see if I can come back to that and get it. My apologies here. Give me 1 second and I can fix that. All right, so this is actually a student who I met with yesterday. So she's a first year at Washington State University, and this illustrates perfectly what I was just talking about. She received $6,300, roughly $6,400 in scholarship for her first year. Right now, what's going to change for you all is you're not going to have access to these grad plus loan awards, right? So that will not be eligible to you. However, this amount will be higher. So this will be 50,000. So the total cost of attendance for this particular student at Washington State in the first year is about $55,000, right? So above that $50,000 threshold. So if you need $6,000 more, this student received that to stay out of needing private loans if this student were, let's say, an example for you next year, right? Let's say this was you next year and you had a $55,000 cost of attendance, right? This would prevent you from needing to obtain that additional $6,000 in private student loans. Right? So this is kind of what this looks like in the financial aid award system for a veterinary school. Sorry, that's a little disorganized there. All right, so let's talk about those schools that will cost you the least, right? So strategies to minimize your cost, start with your in-state school option first, right? And if you don't have a vet school in your state, maybe you live in a region that covers some special arrangements like we have out west here called the Western Interstate Commission on Higher Education, or WICHE. The Southeast has one called the Southern Regional Education Board. There are a number of 2+2 programs that exist where maybe you start your program in your state and then you transition to a different veterinary school that has an arrangement with that particular state and you're paying in-state tuition. There's a 1+3 program that Montana has with Washington State. So those are opportunities that you can investigate. The handful of states that allow you to change your residency status are Missouri, NC State, Ohio State, UC Davis, and Washington State. Now it will probably necessitate you using private loans that first year because you still have to pay the non-resident rate that first year, which is likely going to be above $50,000. Right, so you'll probably still need to tap into some additional funding that first year, but you'll likely graduate with less than $200,000 of student debt, so you might not hit that aggregate maximum. The exception there is probably Ohio State. Ohio State, although they let you change your residency status after the first year, the fourth year is really expensive, right? And some schools have been moving in that direction, right? So even the schools that allow you to change your residency status in that first year, that fourth year can be significantly more expensive than the previous years, which again plays into this worry that I have that, you could get 3/4 of the way through veterinary school and hit a point where you can't obtain that funding for that fourth year to pay for it. Then what, right? That's going to get pretty precarious. right? So you're going to want to do some investigation, some research on the front end to make sure that you don't put yourself in that kind of position where you get 3/4 of the way through vet school and then all of a sudden fourth year costs more than you were expecting and you're having a hard time finding the funds to pay for that last year. One of the other strategies to consider, so when we were putting together the Apply Smarter tool, it turns out, and it turns out I can't spell Texas, but it turns out that all of the Texas schools, whether you're a resident or a non-resident, are below that $170,000 limit that we set for the Mike Dunn scholarship, which again puts you below the new limits for direct unsubsidized loans, right? So if you don't live in Texas, you might put any of those veterinary schools on your radar as schools to apply to because they are some of the least expensive schools you can go to, even if you don't live there. Narrowing your search. I showed you the Apply Smarter tool. I'll show you also the cost of education toolkit here. This is another way that you can see a list of schools that might, just as a kind of scanning here, and this is data from last year, cost of attendance, right? I'm looking for the schools that have a total projected cost of attendance that are less than 200. And I have to scroll down pretty far to get there, right? And I don't find too many, right? Ideally, and these cost of attendance figures represent kind of the upper limit, right? The non-resident seats, and they also include the living expenses, right? If you wanted to see what the resident costs were, right, you'll hit that $200,000 threshold a little bit sooner, and you'll start to see those schools that fall into that category. But for some of these, you're going to have to live in that state, right? Like Kansas, Utah, they don't have arrangements that allow you to change your residency status. So you'd have to actually be a resident of Kansas or a resident of Utah to hit that lower projected cost of attendance.
Can you talk, because that was one of our ri- uh, rising upvoted questions, is about moving to establish residency. Can you kind of touch on that
Yeah, I did that.
outside of
So
those five schools?
certainly. So when I decided I wanted to go to Colorado State, I lived in Illinois. Like I'm from Chicago originally, and I decided Colorado State was going to be my first choice for a number of reasons, primarily because of their combined MBA DVM program. And I researched their residency requirements. What do I need to do to establish residency in Colorado? So when I apply to their vet school, I'm recognized as a resident of Colorado. And every state's a little different, right? For Colorado, I had to live here a year. I had to file a state tax return here, at least one, right? I can't, most states, and Colorado included, you can't just move here 3 months before you apply and say, I'm applying as a resident, right? That won't fly. Right? So you'll probably have to spend some time researching those state requirements if you want to do that type of strategy. If you want to move to a state, establish residency, so you're considered a resident of that state before you apply. But it can be a very efficient strategy because, as I'll show you in just a few minutes, that gets back to the odds of getting in, right? Particularly for land grant institutions, state schools, they often reserve more seats for resident applicants than they do non-resident applicants, which can greatly increase your odds of getting into one of those institutions. So I already showed you this. This is the cost of education toolkit, vet school bound, that you can use that to kind of scroll through and see which of those schools are going to cost you the most. I mean, I really don't take any pleasure in not recommending certain schools, right? But some of these are just so expensive. Under the new structure, it's going to be very difficult for anybody that has to use student loans to get through them without incurring some significant risk. Right? So I would highly recommend that you reconsider some of these schools that have the highest cost profiles, particularly if you have to use student loans, right? It's going to get really messy really quick. So is it hard to get into veterinary school? So the overall application statistics show us that there's about 2.5 applicants for every seat that's available, right? But you have to really dig in to each school to kind of see what you can find. generally speaking, state schools admit more in-state residents than they do out-of-state residents. And usually there are fewer resident applicants for those in-state seats. So you have a higher chance of getting in if you live in that state for the school that has the state or the resident seats. So here's a couple of examples, right? So we've got UC Davis, class of 2029 statistics. We can see that the overwhelming number of, well, not the overwhelming number, but the overwhelming number of applications come from out of state, but the overwhelming offers of admission go to California residents, right? So you have a distinctly better opportunity of obtaining an offer of admission if you live in California and you're applying to UC Davis than those who are living outside of California. It's even more dramatic for NC State, right? So 27% of North Carolina residents were accepted in this particular class pool. I think this is the class of 2023. So this is the most recent data that they have available on their website. But this dynamic plays out for many of the in-state schools, right? So this is one of those things that, you know, as you're narrowing your list of schools that you want to apply to, I would highly recommend that you meet with their office of admissions if it's not easy for you to find this information on their website and ask for it. You know, show me kind of that admissions profile for your recent admitted class so I can better understand that class makeup and understand some of these stats that you have for your particular school. So
Along those lines, we did have a question in the Q&A about, do you expect the schools that are low cost or those that allow you to change residency to become more difficult to get into?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, none of this is going to be a secret, right? I mean, it's going to, you know, and it's already not. I mean, so and schools like NC State, UC Davis, they already get a high amount of out-of-state applicants. You know, not only are they great schools, but I think it's because these are also two schools that allow you to change your residency status after the first year, right? So students that graduate from NC State and UC Davis, not only do you get a great education, but you also tend to graduate with some of the lower amounts of student debt that we see across the profession, right? That is generally not a secret, right? And hopefully it's not a secret to anybody here tonight, right? But you can use that to your advantage so you're one of those people that have less student debt rather than more, right? So yes, it is more difficult to get into some of these schools, particularly if you don't live in that state, right? So, but you can do the calculations yourself, right? I mean, you can still see that the out-of-state applicants to UC Davis are doing a little bit better than the out-of-state applicants to NC State, right? So, you know, by a factor of two there, right? So there's there are differences among these programs and, really depends on the schools that you're targeting. All right, let's finish up with kind of a case. Again, I met with Washington State yesterday, so this is really easy to pull together. And I already mentioned that Washington State has one of the more complicated tuition classification, right? So if you live in Washington, Idaho, Montana, the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, so if you're a WICHE student or non-resident, you all have a little bit different cost profile. This is the cost of attendance for the 2025-2026 starting first year student that is a non-resident at Washington State, right? So 91,734 is the total cost of attendance, right? This particular person, after filling out their financial aid award, you can see here their student aid index was negative, right? Which means they're going to receive the full cost of attendance offered to them in federal direct loans. But next year, that's going to change, right? So if we use this again as a proxy for trying to understand what's going to happen for you next year, if I've got a 91,734 cost of attendance, I'm a non-resident attending Washington State, hoping to get residency tuition the second, third, and fourth year, right? I still have to pay for that first year. And if I need to finance all of that, right? If I need student loans for all of that, right? The first $50,000 comes from direct unsubsidized loans. That means I need to find nearly $42,000 in additional funding, right? And that's probably not going to be as easy as it used to be, right? So the more you have to borrow, the more scrutiny there's going to be, right? That's where your credit score is going to come in, your credit history is going to come in, the quality of that cosigner that you may have to bring to the table. And then, oh, by the way, you have to highly scrutinize those offers for those private loans so you don't sign yourself into something that's going to be very difficult to manage in repayment, right? So this is the part that really is, it's got me sweating a bit for you guys next year, right? So we're here to help you navigate that in any way possible, but this is going to be challenging, right? So ask a lot of questions, get informed, start understanding what that's going to require, particularly if you've never had to seek out financing for anything before. And I'm guessing most of you probably have not, right? So it's gonna be a learning experience for everybody, no doubt. But apply smarter, right? Your odds of acceptance increase generally align with the least costly way to attend veterinary medicine. That's a win-win. Right? There's no Harvard effect for veterinary medicine, whether you graduate from Washington State or Oregon State or Colorado State. I mean, you stand to earn the same amount as anybody else who graduates from any other veterinary school. So resist the temptation to apply to or accept offers of admission to those higher priced schools. The schools that are outside the US are even a little bit more precarious because we're not exactly sure what the borrowing limits are going to look like for them. Right? Roughly 25% of US students attend veterinary schools that are outside the US. I don't know what that's going to look like next fall, right? So we're going to need more guidance from the Department of Education on what that's going to look like and what their borrowing limits are going to be. But I imagine that it's going to be even more difficult to get private loans to attend a university outside of the US, right? Rather than one that's inside the US. So just another thing to consider. Established residency, so we talked about that through the question that came in. Research those contract options or those 2+2, those combined kind of transitional programs. And there's also combined programs as well, like I did an MBA DVM that offer you an opportunity to maybe get in-state tuition or pay a little bit less by virtue of how those programs are structured. So there are more creative ways to get into veterinary school, increase those odds, and decrease your costs and hopefully your reliance on those private loans that you may need. All right, what additional questions you have? We've already shown the Apply Smarter folder. So any other? I don't have any. I don't have any housekeeping for us to do other than answer questions.
Would you mind to show getting back to the Apply Smarter message boards one more time? Because I think that'll be a
Sure.
good thing to show. And then I'm going to start looking at our top upvoted questions.
Sure. So I would start with this vinfoundation.org free vet app link, and we can post that in the chat if it hasn't already been done. And then go through the create account process. It's pretty quick. We need your name, email, phone, and when it asks you for what school, put your top choice of veterinary school in there, right? So whatever your number one choice is for veterinary school, put that in, and then take your best guess of your graduation date, right? So if you're applying for class entering in fall of 2026, your graduation date would be, roughly April, May, June of 2030, right? So if you're attending or planning to attend vet school in 2027, most likely you're going to graduate in 2031, with the exception of Arizona, which is a 3-year program, right? So you can, get through that application as best you can. It'll generate a username and password. Once you're there, then you can log in and you'll be on the VIN Foundation Center. You'll see the Apply Smarter tile here. There's a bunch of other great information here as well, right? You'll have access to more stuff, but what we're focused on here is the Apply Smarter message board. You'll even have access to the student debt message board, which goes through our colleagues' questions on student loan repayment. Now that's a whole different beast because that's changing too. And, don't get too bogged down in that right now of what repayment looks like because, you're not to or through veterinary school yet, and there's probably still going to be a lot that changes between now and then in terms of repayment. But generally, we know that those federal student loans are going to be the most flexible and have the most flexible repayment options. Those private loans are going to be a wild card that we're going to have um, to figure out a creative way to deal with as you work your way through your veterinary career. But the Apply Smarter message board lives under the Apply Smarter tile here. Here's a link. And it'll take you to where we were showing you earlier, right? So you can browse these discussions that are already in here, or you can start your own. You can contribute to those as well. So you can post questions if you find one that's like, oh, I have a question about that. You can go into that discussion and reply. You have the option to post anonymously. Here's that anonymous checkbox. You would give your discussion a title, type what you want to say, and post that message.
All right, I'm going to focus on our top upvoted questions. So if you see one that's similar to yours, give it that thumbs up in the Q&A, and that'll help us to identify those. The first one that I have here is, what online resources can I use to find private scholarships for first-year students? And I'm going to add on to that to talk about scholarships in vet school in general.
Yeah, that's a tough one. There's not a great clearinghouse for every scholarship that's available. One that comes to mind that's a good starting point is the American Veterinary Medical Foundation. So kind of like VIN Foundation is the nonprofit arm of VIN. AVMF is the nonprofit arm of the AVMA, the American Veterinary Medical Association. They have a pretty good list of scholarships. I believe the AAVMC also has a pretty good list of scholarships. Um, I would start with your school, right? The schools are every school, in addition, I mean, so the resources I just listed, the AVMF, the AVMC, or any kind of national list of veterinary school scholarships are they're probably going to be more national scholarships, which means they're eligible for everybody. They're going to be highly competitive, a little bit more difficult to maybe obtain. I'd say the sweet spot is at the school level, right? You want to sit down with that dean's office, the veterinary school dean's office, and say, show me the scholarships that you guys have available for your students so I can understand that a little bit better, because every school has a little bit different scholarship pool, right? And some schools do a great job of making sure that all of their students receive a pretty good chunk of scholarship money. Other schools, not so much. Right, so it's going to be highly variable depending on the school. So that's another piece of information that I would add to your research as you're targeting that list of schools that you're going to apply to. Maybe you want to target ones that do a better job of providing more or higher dollar amounts of scholarships than others. It's a bit of a, when it comes to scholarships, it's a bit of a wild west, right? So you can find lists of those nationally available scholarships, but probably the best place to start is at that local school level that you're planning to attend.
Does FAFSA work the same in vet school as it does in undergrad?
Yes and no, right? So when you go through the FAFSA application, it's going to look very similar, but when they determine that you're applying for financial aid for a professional school program, they're not going to care about all of your parents' financial information, right? They're going to care about your financial information, right? So whereas before for undergrad, you're more concerned with putting in your parents' income and asset numbers to determine your student aid index for undergraduate loans. Graduate school doesn't care about your parents' financial information. The exception to that is the health profession student loan, but that's not handled through FAFSA. That's handled directly through the school that's going to have a separate application for you to apply for those health profession student loans if they offer them, and those are probably going to ask for your parents' financial information.
Everybody's favorite answer. Yes and no.
Yes and no, right? It's better than it
Yep.
depends, right?
Right. Yeah. I was gonna say
Slightly
that
better.
is everyone's favorite
Yeah.
answer for sure. We've got one here, and this is a good question. If you're starting in August 2026, starting vet school, can you initiate loans prior to 6/30 for that fall semester in order to be grandfathered into the current student loan situation?
I don't think so. The
Nope.
only the only I think the only school that might have that opportunity is Mississippi State.
Yep.
Mississippi State starts really early, and you may be able to get a loan this received before July 1st of 2026 for if you're starting school at Mississippi State in the fall of 2026. That would be the only exception I can think of.
I agree. Yeah, that's about the only one that I could think of as well. Another question here with the upcoming federal loan changes for those that will be paying cash or have some other funding and then needing loans for part of their cost of attendance as well. Is it better to take out the loans all along and pay cash for some, or should I pay cash until that runs out? How would you balance those different funding opportunities?
Yeah, that's gonna be a question that I think you should post in the message boards, right? Because
Absolutely.
it really depends on what schools we're talking about, what cost of attendance we're talking about, how much cash we're talking about, and what you think your eligibility will be for private loans, right? So those are going to all be factors that we're going to have to consider as you work through those decisions. As general guidelines, if you have some money dedicated to cover some of your educational expenses, it's going to have the biggest impact if you use it earlier on in the program, right? Because then you avoid those loans that have the maximum amount of time to accrue interest, right? But you also don't want to put yourself in a precarious financial position, right? The
Hmm.
fact that you said, do you want to use that money until it runs out makes me think maybe that's not a great use of those funds, right? The goal here is not to necessarily avoid student loans at all cost, right? It's kind of a pros and cons type of thing. And how much risk are we exposing ourselves to, right? The more we have to take in private student loans, the more we're increasing our risk, not only to getting through veterinary school, but paying for those loans after. Right? So we want to do what we can, what's reasonable to reduce that risk. It's not reasonable to think that everybody is going to be able to not use private loans, right? We're going to have to use some private loans in most cases, right? But can we keep that use to a minimum, and can we get the maximum terms and conditions on those loans as possible? And some of that's going to really depend on what you plan to do as a veterinarian. And that's a huge wild card. I mean, you're going to change your mind probably 15 times, you know, before you even get in, and then another 15 times after you get in. Right. So that's going to be pretty tough. For those of you that, know that you're not going to do anything other than X, that's helpful, right? That's helpful to know. Then, well, we can match that up against an earnings profile after, and then we can also use that to help assess that risk and how much you can take on in student loans and private student loans and comfortably be able to pay for pay for that balance.
This is rapidly becoming my favorite question. Is it likely that vet schools will increase or decrease their tuition because of these changes?
Oh yeah, it really depends. What's going to depend on is you all. It's going to depend on how you change your application behaviors, right? If most of you, I've been trying to wave this magic wand for years. If most of you stopped applying to the most expensive schools and seats, and they couldn't fill those seats, they would have to decrease their cost because the demand would not be there to keep the price where it is. But because so many students are still applying to every vet school, and there's enough of you to go around to cover all of the seats, no matter what the cost is, they can keep increasing the cost, right? Because the demand is there, right? So it is really up to you all, right? And we haven't seen a lot of evidence that pre-veterinary students are willing to change their application behavior yet. So the schools don't have to change their pricing behavior either, right? But as soon as they have a harder time filling those most expensive seats, those seat costs will come down, right? But they're going to do their darndest to keep those seat prices where they are and maybe even keep increasing them while they're still being filled. right? So that's why we do these, right? Is to try to help you stay out of those scenarios that has you paying the maximum price. Whereas before it was very, I want to say easy, but it was definitely possible to get through veterinary school because the loan money was always there. Right now that's changed, right? And the repayment on the other side is not nearly as beneficial. So we're going to see some challenges uh, for people who have higher student loan balances and mixed federal and private student loan balances. They're going to have a difficult time paying for those loans, right? So, those of you that are taking notes from sessions like this can avoid that scenario.
For sure. I've always said there's far too many of you on this call that will sell your soul to become a veterinarian. And like
Yeah,
Tony was saying, before it was easy enough to do. And now it's a very different situation that I want you to be asking these questions. Unfortunately, Dr. Bartels and I have seen far too many veterinarians on the back end of this that are like, well, why did nobody tell me?
right.
So this is why we
Yep,
have these conversations.
indeed.
Good question here. What about cost advantages of 3-year programs, say Ross or Arizona State? Will that help?
Yeah, yeah. The only so the even though the timeline is compressed, you're still paying, there's still the same number of semesters. So you're not saving any money there. You do save a little bit of money from interest, and you start earning income sooner, right? So there are some cost savings there. Um, However, when you're talking about a school like Ross is one of the most expensive schools out there. Right? So even though you might get a little bit of savings because you're not accruing as much interest over a shorter period of time, and you get to become a veterinarian slightly faster, the increased cost to do it does not necessarily justify that shorter time frame. Right? So if the shorter time frame is because you can't stand being in school for 4 years and you'd like to trim that down sooner, then sure, right? But from a strictly financial standpoint, Ross doesn't really fit that model. And Arizona does if you live in Arizona, right?
Hmm.
Arizona is a state school. You pay significantly less if you're a resident of Arizona. You're going to pay more as a non-resident. So again, the same thing applies. If you're applying to Arizona as an out-of-state student to get through school faster, thinking that it's going to save you money, well, you're paying a higher premium to be an out-of-state student, right? So you kind of lose that benefit, that cost benefit, by taking that non-resident seat.
I see another question here. Let's see. Actually, I'm going to refresh this so I can see my most upvoted. What time should a vet school applicant fill out FAFSA while waiting for acceptance or after accepted?
Usually after you're accepted, but if you can also apply for FAFSA and include the schools that you've applied to, right? So presuming that you're going to get into one of the schools that you applied to, you can fill out FAFSA with the information that these are the schools that I applied to, right? So if they do want you to start that application sooner than you know where you're going, you can always include that application, to the schools that you've applied to.
How do students pay for living expenses while in vet school since it's hard to maintain income?
Yeah, they borrow money, right?
Living off
So
loans.
yeah, they living on loans, right? So that's where that cost of attendance comes in. If I come back to, I've got here, here I've got, again, because I've been using this as an example because I've been working on it all week. But Washington State, right? So there's a tuition and fees amount, right? But then there's an allocation for your living expenses, right? But again, the problem is, whereas you could get federal student loans to cover all of this relatively easily up till now, those that are starting programs next fall are going to hit that $50,000 limit, right? And depending on which cost profile you're in, you might hit that $50,000 limit just trying to pay the tuition and fees, which means you have to borrow money to cover the rest of the tuition and fees in addition to the projected living expenses, right? So, and that's where you're looking most likely for a private loan, right? That will be largely based on this cost of attendance estimate, how much federal student loan you've already applied for and received. Then you're using that additional funding, seeking that additional funding through the private lender to cover those additional estimated costs. But that's where it's also going to be incumbent on you to come up with a budget too, right? This will be a starting point. This is what the school thinks it's going to cost you to live, right? But you're going to need to put some effort in on that other side of things to say, well, what's going to cost you to live there, right? It may be significantly less than what the school thinks. It may be significantly more, right? You're probably going to get asked that question by your private lender, right? So you're going to maybe want to have a budget or some way of estimating what your monthly living expenses are going to be for the school that you're going to attend.
Glenn had a question here about his example was a combined MBA DVM program and those programs that are longer than 4 years. I think that's in relation to the 50,000 a year, $200,000
Yeah.
limit.
Yeah, and you know those are going to be highly variable depending on the specifics of those programs. Like when I did the MBA DVM program at Colorado State, I didn't have to take any student loans for the MBA portion, and it added an additional year to my schooling. So I didn't really take loans until I started the second year, which was year 2 of 5 of my program. So, you know, in that respect, it kind of worked the same as a normal or traditional 4-year veterinary program. But not all of those combined programs are the same. It really depends on the specifics of those circumstances. But yeah, those some of those that maybe like particularly the PhD ones, right? They normally have you doing veterinary school, or maybe you do 2 years of veterinary school and then take some time to do the PhD component and then go back and do the clinical part. If you're continuing to have to borrow through the duration of that, you're probably going to hit that $200,000 limit somewhere in the middle there, right? And that could make that very complicated. So understanding the details of those combined programs, the cost of those, having that laid out before you accept admission to something like that is going to be important to know under the new borrowing rules.
Will a vet student be at a disadvantage by attending a vet school with a 3-year program and that does not have a teaching hospital?
According to the AVMA, no, right? Those programs are still accredited, provisionally accredited, whether they have teaching hospitals or not, right? That's more of a preference on your end in terms of how do you think you're going to learn best, right? So the schools that do have a teaching program, obviously you're going to spend a lot of time in that teaching hospital. The schools that don't typically have what are called distributed models, where they send you to a variety of clinics that they partner with, where you get your clinical education. So you still have to meet the same accreditation standards that all the schools have, whether they have a teaching hospital or not. It's more on you to kind of think about how would you prefer to get that clinical experience on your end.
The only thing that I would add on to that is for current vet students, VIN each fall does a roundtable on internships and residencies. And one of the considerations that has come up there is if you are planning to specialize and looking at an internship and residency, some of those programs may have preferences about if you attended a school with a teaching hospital versus a distributive model. That's a little bit further on than our audience here. However, if I have somebody that's listening that is diehard needs to be a surgeon, then that's something to think about for sure. We are getting to the top of our second hour here, so I wanted to check in, Tony. Do you want to take a couple more, or we can
Yeah,
start wrapping up here?
we could take a couple more, and then yeah, let's take a couple more. There's still a good chunk of people here, so.
Okay, sounds good. I do see one here from somebody that is receiving the Cal grant and other grants, and I know that you do a lot of work with UC Davis, so you may be familiar with this or not. How does that translate into what I get once I'm in vet school?
Yeah, that's excellent question. I was searching around before here to see if I could find an example financial aid award that had the Cal Grant in it, and I wasn't successful. But yeah, so UC Davis is pretty unique in that regard. So let me see if I can quickly go to, I have that in my presentation. The UC Davis, if you do UC Davis cost of attendance, um, California, or at least at UC Davis, they provide a grant to any tuition paying student. And let's see if I can, they keep changing this page and I always end up on the wrong one. Um, I don't have that quickly at hand, but it kind of works similar. So let me pull over my Washington State one again. Ooh, yikes. You guys don't want to see that. That's the one big beautiful bill.
That is the bill.
And that's just one section of it. Where is my, oh, I don't have that bill either. Okay. So when you get a grant, um, like the UC Davis Cal Grant, it'll subtract off from your required cost of attendance, right? So that will be money that will be applied to your tuition and fees and will reduce the amounts that you need for student loans. So you can that grant will be directly applied to costs such as tuition and fees or your living expenses and part of your package. So let's say your cost of attendance was $55,000 and routinely UC Davis tuition paying students get a $7,000 or somewhere between $7,000 and $8,000 grant each year. That would reduce the amount that you need from 55 down to 48. And then you would take student loans to cover the rest. So if you're at 48 in that example, right, you can get up to $50,000 per year of federal student loans. You would only need that remaining 48, right? You're good, right? You don't even need private student loans. So a school like UC Davis that provides that Cal Grant is hugely beneficial. Another reason why we don't see UC Davis graduates have very high student debt balances is because of that grant that they receive, and they don't really advertise that, right? And I think it's because they're perennially scared that they're going to lose access to that, and that's always a possibility, right? I mean, the state, just like the federal government here, decided, hey, we're going to do something different with student loans. The state all of a sudden can say, we can't afford to offer that grant anymore, right? So, you may not necessarily get that all 4 years. It's not necessarily guaranteed. Although I can say that for as long as I've been doing this, which is more than 10 years now, students have been getting that grant, right? So it's been pretty consistent, but there's always that chance that maybe this is going to be the year or next year is going to be the year where they have to alter that.
Melissa here is bringing up some fun issues. As a CSU alum and Colorado DVM, how do you think the new Veterinary Professional Associate VPA will impact the profession? And do you think that's likely to spread across vet schools?
Um, ooh, well, impact too soon to tell,
Yeah,
right? We're all going to be eagerly waiting to see what that looks like. Do I think it's going to catch on? Yeah, I do. I think we're going to see more of that. Um,
I agree.
yeah. So but it's in the very infant stages of that. It's going to take a couple of years to crank out the first couple for the first class of those VPAs from CSU. So we'll see how the market receives them and it's really going to depend on what the market dynamics are in veterinary medicine at that time and beyond. But it's just too soon to tell. But I do think we're going to see other states implement something similar to Colorado State. But I think they're also waiting to see what the impact is going to be as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would agree with that. I don't know how much we will be able to dive into this one here. This might be one that's good for the boards, is how will the VAGI bill work if I'm using it for undergrad as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. We need to, and I knew this was going to come up because every time we do an Apply Smarter session, there's questions about either military scholarship opportunities or GI bills. And I admittedly do not know enough about that. And we need to put together something that tries to break that down for the variety of opportunities that are out there and how they might interact with the new borrowing rules. But I do not know the answers to those questions yet.
With the vet shortage, will wages increase and make repayment easier? My crystal ball's in the shop.
Yeah. Ooh, man, that's a loaded one. That's kind of beyond the scope of what we're going to tackle here this evening. You know, to be determined, right? We have seen salaries go up consistently over the last several years. Whether that will continue, it really depends. So,
I think we've also
depend.
seen them start to plateau here a bit as well.
Yeah, the rate of increase is definitely slowed a bit. It is still on the rise. We'll get another data set, another data point for the 2025 graduating class here soon. I anticipate that it'll be at or above what the 2024 class was experiencing. But yeah, it kind of remains to be seen.
Yep. Yep. And especially for you all in this cohort of pre-veterinary students, I mean, you could be just getting started in your undergrad, so there's still a ways to go there to be able to predict that one.
Absolutely.
Will specializing still be possible or worth it?
Oh, definitely.
Hmm.
Definitely worth it. Definitely possible. It's going to get complicated for sure, depending on how much private student loan balance you have. So the lower your private student loan balance, the more favorable those private student loan terms are. The lender that we talked to yesterday says that they're going to have some kind of a, advanced training deferment option in them. Again, the problem with the private loans is that they're not all consistent, right? It kind of depends on your ability to find one or find multiple ones that will be flexible enough to allow you to navigate something like an internship or residency, right? So it's definitely possible with your federal student loans, right? And the federal student loan repayment options are actually very favorable for helping you navigate an internship and residency. And depending on the specialization that you're pursuing, there's some pretty
Significant incomes.
yeah, significant incomes on the other side. Not for all of them, right? But for many of them, right? So it really depends on the specialty you're pursuing, and your student loan portfolio, right? To determine how complicated that's going to be for you.
For sure. Is there a chance the loan changes as a result of the BBB can or will not go into effect next year as a result of pushback or be altered again in the favor of students?
The pendulum swings two ways, right? It's swung in a direction that's not terribly favorable for borrowers right now. It can certainly swing in another direction. Just depends on when. I do anticipate next year to be a mess. There's just no way around it. And I think based on what that looks like, how messy it is, the feedback that the administration receives from schools and programs, and how willing they are to adjust things, we may see some things change. But right now, we kind of have to go with how things are written, right? And see how they play out. We can't, I mean, what the one thing I can say is things have changed, right? And they will change again. It's just a matter of when and what that change will be, right? So another one that's just it's too soon to tell, right? So right now we have to kind of work with what's written down and go from there.
We have a question they said was a bit off topic, but I think it is a good question. If we apply through VEMCAS, when do we typically find out if we are accepted or not? Tyler had shared his experience of it being school dependent and possibly earlier for in-state and later for out of state on those schools. Um, it is quite school dependent in my experience as well.
Yeah, right. And you'll generally those offers will start to trickle out at the beginning of the year, right? So January, February, March, and I think it's April 15th, if I don't remember, or right around April, or is when you have to kind of let them know, whether or not you're going or not going. So somewhere in the beginning of the year, springtime, you'll start to hear. And there is a date that you have to let them know. I just can't remember what it is right now.
Yeah, and that has been made a little bit more complicated by the multiple cohorts at some schools. So for example, if you're getting an offer for a cohort that's starting in January of 2026, then your offer is going to come sooner. So that has changed that a little bit as well. What school should I apply to if I am a diehard surgeon? I found the person.
Yeah, I'm steering clear of that one. I would say, well, you should first apply to your in-state school,
Yes.
right? So start there, right? And if you don't have one in-state, then, pick one of those other ones that are going to allow you to pay as little as you can.
I definitely agree with that. And again, sitting in on that internship and residency roundtable the last couple of years, I mean, yes, go to an AVMA accredited vet school, get your degree. But there's so much more of it, that's also letters of recommendation, your professional skills, things like that that are going to play into internship and residency as well. So I agree with Tony. Focus on those low cost schools, especially with these changes that we're seeing and those low income earning years of internship and residency for sure. Got a question here. Will the new rules make the employer contributions to student loan repayment more valuable?
Mm, Potentially, I think it's going to depend on your loan makeup and how easy it's going to be to target them specifically to private loans. So, I, you know, ge- generally speaking, your federal student loans are the most flexible loans you're going to have. Any other loans that you're going to have beyond that are going to be less flexible, which means you're going to want to try to get rid of those first. So if those employers are going to have systems available that'll allow you to target those payments to the less flexible loans in your portfolio, then they could be more beneficial. Uh, but for those of you that may still be on a pathway to reach forgiveness or something like public service loan forgiveness, they may not be very beneficial. So it's a mixed bag, and it really depends on the circumstances and the details of your student loan portfolio. But potentially there are some cases to be made where they'll be slightly more beneficial than they have been previously.
Do you think any colleges will alter tuition or add more scholarships and grants as early as fall 2026?
I mean, they're always trying to add more scholarships
Yeah.
and grants, and generally those scholarship funds have been increasing, albeit at a much slower pace than the tuition increases tend to happen. So yes, I think they're always trying to find ways to make sure that the students can pay for those educations. It's going to be very challenging going forward here. So I think it's a lot to be learned and a lot to unfold, particularly in this 2026 class that's going to start next fall. I think we're going to start to see what that looks like going forward.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's hard for such a big beast as a university to course change on tuition and costs like that within a year. I mean, there's a process behind how those are set for sure.
I think a lot more of them are going to be looking into health profession student loans.
Yep.
So the schools that don't offer them, I think they're going to be looking into how they can offer them. So that might be beneficial for you.
Melissa would like to know a couple of the more lucrative specialty areas.
Well, we don't have
Depends.
tons of data on all of the specialties, but the ones that stand out are, surgery. Most of the ones in the internal medicine college tend to have some pretty strong incomes. Pathologists do pretty well from the data I've seen. For them, they actually have a very good income report for the pathology college. So those are the ones that come to mind. Neurologists do pretty darn well, right? So um, to the extent that the specialty colleges publish their own survey data on income, that's super helpful. Um, Dr. Samarello has done some studies on specialty and specialists and published some of their income information. So those are some sources you can look for. But it'd be great to light a fire under some of the other specialty colleges that don't publish income information to start doing some surveys. And so we do have more of that information available.
I see that Brittany mentioned that we don't see those higher incomes with zoo or rehab. Yeah, I mean that's the other side of the coin, right? Is not all of them. result
right?
in significantly higher salaries.
Although I
Um,
will say the zoo ones tend to have something like public service loan forgiveness
correct.
available because most of the zoo veterinarians are working for a 501(c)(3) nonprofit. Not all of them, right? But many of them are, right? And public service loan forgiveness is, can be a pretty special benefit to help offset some of that lower income.
Brittany was wondering about in the application process, what GPA requirement is a good goal or was a goal for others that have already gone through the process. I do think those class profiles that Dr. Bartels mentioned earlier from each of the schools is a really good resource there.
Absolutely. A lot of those schools that in their admitted class statistics will publish that information, right? What's the average GPA of those applicants and those that were accepted? So that would be the first place that I would start is looking for those application statistics for those given schools that you're targeting.
All right, and then Melanie's got a question here in regards to vets being paid more in a salary. Given a great deal of vets go into private practice, isn't the way to be paid more to charge clients more? I own a farm and have over 300 head of various livestock. If I can't treat them myself, I call the vet and pay their fees. Am I wrong? Am I thinking?
No, not at all. That's the demand for veterinary services is what directly translates into veterinary salaries,
Yep.
right? So if our clients are willing to pay more or have a strong and increasing demand for veterinary services, then you will earn more, right? So and we have seen a spike in demand for veterinary services ever since the pandemic, and that's still playing out, right? Everybody keeps looking for, is there a ceiling, right? Are we going to see a pullback or slowdown? And there's, some evidence here and there that we might be seeing a little bit of a pullback. But yeah, I mean, if demand for veterinary services decreases, then salaries will decrease as well, right? So that pendulum swings both ways too.
Yep. And I think we can wrap it up with this great reminder from Glenn of please remember that public service loan forgiveness does not apply to private loans.
Absolutely. Thank you, Glenn, for
Mhm.
reminding me that. Yeah. So public service loan forgiveness, income driven repayment, only options for your federal direct loans. Private loans cannot be made eligible for those types of benefits. So just another, please, please, please read the fine print carefully on those private loan offers before you sign them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. For those troopers of you that hung in here for the whole 2 hours, great job. Thank you. I know we've had to have some people drop off, understandably. We will be wrapping up with any kind of Dr. Bartel's last thoughts and things. I do want to remind you that there will be a follow-up email. It will have the Prezi link. It'll have this recording, some other helpful information. Give us a couple days to get that all together. Unfortunately, we are a small team trying to churn all of this out, so it may not be tomorrow, but we usually do try to get it out by the end of the week. So that'll be coming to you in the next couple of days. Jordan, Taylor, thank you so much, and Dr. Bartels, any last thoughts?
No, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mears, and thank you, Jordan and Taylor as well. And thanks to all of you that took the time out to attend this. And please keep asking questions. Please report back your experience
Yes.
as you're working through this, because that's how we learn and then how we can also incorporate that additional information into future sessions here as we're all trying to navigate this changing landscape.
Yeah, and just one last plug for that Apply Smarter message board. I mean, that's really what it is built on, is community learning and sharing that knowledge. And it's just, I mean, that is a really great part of the veterinary profession. So definitely check that out. Thanks,
Uh,
everyone.
yep. Thank you. Good night, everyone.